Hello, welcome back to the workshop. This is the second of the videos we're discussing death statistics in England and Wales since 2010. It's just a reminder that we're using aggregate data here, categorised by underlying cause of death. And the data comes from the Office for National Statistics, a very reputable source and one that I'm quite happy to trust. We saw in the last video that 2020 has had the lowest number of deaths from underlying respiratory causes since any year since at least 2015, and well below all others since 2010 and maybe for some time before. So I'll give you a quick review of the charts from the last video now, just to remind you what you look like, and just to remind you that 2020 looks very much like every other year in this range. If there's any difference, 2020 is generally better than other years and it's much better than some. All of the data that we're using is accurate, the charts are fair, and they give a good representation of the underlying data. If you were presented with these charts and nothing else, then you'd probably be quite sure that nothing untoward was going on. And for a politician, that kind of knowledge that a simple statement can be backed up with facts can be enough, and grand strategies may be built up based just upon that. For anybody that understands data though, there's a lot more to see. I ended the last video with the statement that 2020 was actually a very exceptional year, despite what most of the charts showed. I left you with this one that showed just how exceptional it was, although I didn't explain why this was. When I put the title onto the chart, you'll see that it shows the figures for respiratory deaths expressed as a percentage of all deaths from all causes in the same period. As before, you will see that all years follow much the same path. In this case though, apart from one, and that one is 2020. You'll see that in March 2020 there was a 15% probability that any death was caused by an underlying respiratory condition. By April though, that probability had dropped to just 7%. What's going on? We're told incessantly that there is a severe respiratory illness assailing the population, but the chance of dying from it dropped by half in a couple of months in the spring, to the lowest level for many years. And we've seen that the actual number of people dying from respiratory illness is much the same in 2020 as it has been for the past 11 years. What exactly is going on? We now need one more piece of information, and that is the number of all deaths in the same geographical area in the same period. This chart shows all deaths from all causes, all ages, in England and Wales for each of the weeks from week 1 2010 to week 42 2020. As before, all of the year data follows much of the same trajectory, apart from 2020, which is a very strange excursion between weeks 14 and 24, after which it folds back into the mainstream again. To anyone familiar with how data behaves, this is very unusual, especially in light of the previous year's behaviour, and it requires some investigation. To anyone unfamiliar with how data behaves, it just looks a bit clunky. We can see there was a period of 11 weeks of unusually high death rates in England and Wales from weeks 14 to 24. The shape of the excursion is suggestive, but we'll discuss that in more detail in a future video. The deviation at week 19 is due to reporting delays caused by the May Bank holiday, as you can actually see in every year's trace, but in a much smaller amplitude. But if the percentages of respiratory deaths dropped off so much, even though the total deaths soared, what does that tell us? It tells us that the extra deaths were not due to underlying respiratory conditions. But it would seem likely that SARS-CoV-2, being a novel virus with no pre-existing herd immunity, found some susceptible people who were already sick and hastened their ends. Every year, death rates increase in the cold months. Officially, winter is December to March. The Office for National Statistics note that, and I quote, "The excess winter mortality index in England in 2018 to 2019 was statistically significantly lower than the 2016 to 2017 and 2017 to 2018 winters. And the excess winter mortality index in Wales in 2018 to 2019 was statistically significantly lower than all years since the 2013 to 2014 winter. End of quote. This means that there was a significant reserve of older, sicker people who had survived the previous mild winter period, predominantly residing in nursing homes. At the beginning of week 12 in 2020, Imperial College London published their now infamous projection of up to 560,000 deaths from coronavirus and predicted a completely overwhelmed NHS if precautions were not immediately taken. The government started clearing about 15,000 elderly hospital patients into care homes, and from week 13 onwards there was a huge increase in deaths, largely in care homes. The period between infection and death, if there is to be a death from the infection, is generally accepted to be between 2 to 4 weeks. Given that the peak of the deaths can be seen in weeks 15 and 16, and the majority of deaths occurred in care homes, it would seem to be a reasonable deduction that a large number of unprepared care homes had simultaneously become contaminated with virus carriers deported from hospitals. I can only assume this is the case until more research is done, but it seems like a reasonable conclusion. This was not just a British phenomenon. Dr. Sebastian Rushworth, writing on Ivor Cummins' blog, talks about a large quantity of what he called dry tinder waiting in Swedish care homes, which were also badly hit. And this was from the same reason. The Swedish care facilities had done a very good job of keeping very old and very sick people alive during previous mild winters. In the UK, by week 23, most of the dry tinder had been consumed, and death rates returned to near normal. In the 14th century, an early form of biological warfare was practiced in the Crimea, when the plague-ridden bodies of Mongol warriors were catapulted into the besieged town of Theodosia, although the attackers probably didn't realise just how their attack worked. The medical authorities in the 21st century should really have understood what was likely to happen was placing large numbers of infected people into environments with large numbers of frail disease candidates. We'll now have a look at a couple of cumulative graphs. The first one you've already seen in the previous video, and that's the cumulative count of deaths by week for the years 2010 to 2020. And it shows that none of the years have any unusual distribution of deaths in that period. This one, it shows the cumulative deaths over the same period, but for all causes. And most of the lines are pretty much the same as all the others, except for one. And of course that is 2020. The big lump of excess deaths that we saw in the previous chart caused the increased gradient that you'll see in the red line in this chart from week 13 to week 21, at which point the line becomes pretty much the same gradient as the rest. This shows that over that short period there was a much higher rate of death than there have been for the other years. But then after that, the rate is pretty much the same as it has been for the past decade or more. When 2021 starts, the cumulative chart will of course start from 0 again at the bottom left, and the 2021 line, I expect, will proceed up to the top right, in amongst all of the other lines, and again will not become an exceptional year, unless something very odd happens, as happened this year, with the panicked political reaction to a new virus. So there you are. We've seen from the previous video that presenting data in a particular way can produce a particular view of a situation. This is the sort of behaviour that gave rise to the quote that I misattributed to Disraeli, that there are lies, damned lies in statistics. In fact, it's the kind of behaviour that's more like the way that a drunk man uses a lamppost for support rather than illumination. However, once all of the relevant data items are considered, the picture can be rather different. And instead of being the safest year for a long time in which to acquire a respiratory ailment, that is only the case as long as you're not already frail or otherwise health compromised by sickness, age or obesity. We've also seen that a panicked political reaction to an ill-considered projection from an organisation with a long history of overly pessimistic and indeed failed projections seems to have resulted in slightly over 53,000 deaths. The next video will be a closer look at the numbers in the surge of deaths in Q2 2020, and will attempt to show that the shape of the bulge demonstrated that the epidemic in Britain had pretty much finished by the middle of the year. After that, we'll have a change from numbers and taken on something a bit lighter. So we'll be having a critical look at the legislation that's been put in place to deal with this so-called crisis. Until then, your health.